The United Nations has warned of a full-scale war in Israel and Gaza as the death toll from airstrikes rapidly increases. In fact, the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process tweeted the following: "Stop the fire immediately. We're escalating toward a full-scale war. Leaders on all sides have to take responsibility of de-escalation." Part of that I disagree with, to be honest. The cost of war in Gaza is devastating and is being paid by ordinary people. UN is working with all sides to restore calm. Stop the violence now. Now, while there are certainly calls for both sides to stop using any type of violence, the fact of the matter is Hamas has agreed to a truce if Israel agrees to stop using airstrikes against the people of Gaza. Clearly they have not stopped doing that, and Benjamin Netanyahu has not agreed to a truce. So that's important context to the story that I think is missing from a lot of these reports. The Biden administration also tried to block a UN Security Council statement demanding de-escalation, and I think that's relevant to this story. Before a further upsurge of violence, the 15-member Security Council began discussions on a draft statement that would express concern about the clashes and the potential evictions, call on Israel to cease Jewish settlement activities, demolitions and evictions, and urge general restraint. Now, that doesn't seem controversial to me at all, but apparently it does for the Biden administration. Such statements have to be agreed by consensus, but diplomats said the United States, a close ally of Israel, told council counterparts that the body would not issue a statement at the moment. And then finally, speaking on condition of anonymity, the source said Washington is, quote, actively engaged in diplomacy behind the scenes with all parties to achieve a ceasefire, and was concerned that a council statement might be counterproductive at the moment. John.
Well, counterproductive to certain goals, not necessarily the common sense ones that would come out of this, like people not dying anymore. But that is the most important goal for people like me, probably people like Anna, some others. It's not the most important for most people in Washington. It's clearly not the most important for Joe Biden or his administration. And it's gotta be reassuring for Americans who've obviously been through a lot politically for the past few years. Things have been so chaotic, and you might have thought that switching over from Donald Trump to Joe Biden was just gonna mean that everything changes. But not everything. Some things, like the US's stance on Israel and their right to self-defense, and boy, is each of those words pulling a lot of weight, hasn't really changed. It didn't change from Trump to Biden. Although, I don't even know if Biden really criticized the movement of the embassy, but a lot of Democrats were like, well, come on, this is too incendiary. We'd prefer to just allow all the settlements to continue forever. That's a little bit more low key. Because remember, Obama wasn't great on these issues. He came into office saying he was going to push back against some of the provocations, and he chose not to do that once he was president. That was pretty much what Trump was like. And it looks like that's what Biden is gonna be like. So some things really don't change. I'm often critical of the people who try to imply that there's no difference between the parties, because I think that that's lazy thinking. But there are some issues where it is difficult to find those differences.
I agree with you full-heartedly, especially when it comes to foreign policy, because we've seen a continuation of the same foreign policy, regardless of which administration is in charge, which political party is in charge. Obama was a continuation of Bush-era foreign policy, in fact, an expansion of Bush-era foreign policy. Donald Trump continued that with an expansion of drone strikes and signature strikes, US involvement in Yemen, weapons sales in India and Japan. And now we're experiencing much of the same when it comes to the conflict in Israel and conflicts all over the globe. I mean, just our current involvement in Yemen, it still exists, and we haven't really seen much of a change. Now, also the idea that the Biden administration would come in and tell the UN Security Council, please don't issue a statement calling on de-escalation. I mean, it just tells you everything you need to do. Biden apparently had a conversation with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and issued a very vague statement about how I think things are gonna calm down now, when there's really no indication that that's happening or that's the case. And in fact, the death toll has continued to rise. I hesitate to even tell you the exact numbers because by the time you watch this video, it's very likely that the numbers will be much higher. But it's literally dozens of people on the Palestinian side and about, at this moment, as we do this video, about 6 people on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, the reason why you have dozens of people dead is because when Israel does airstrikes in Gaza, they hit their targets. They don't have the Iron Dome. They don't have the same military capability. They don't have the same protection that Israel does. And I'm glad that Israel does. But to treat this as if it's this equal situation, as if this is some sort of fair conflict with both sides holding the same military might, the same power, the same capability is a complete and utter lie. And I'm tired of people presenting it that way. It is not the case. And it's also important to understand who the aggressors were in the first place. Benjamin Netanyahu decided to engage aggressively against Arabs in Israel and of course against Palestinians in Gaza. And we have evidence of that. This is a conflict that at the moment was actually pretty dormant. Obviously it's an ongoing conflict, I'm not taking away from that. But things seemed pretty peaceful lately until Netanyahu decided to take a few actions. We'll remind you of what those actions are in just a second. But before we do, I want to get to this video of the Al-Sharuk Tower, which was targeted in an airstrike. This is a tower which provided office space for several media, including international organizations. In central Gaza City, being leveled by Israeli warplanes, the latest tower block to be destroyed. In fact, just yesterday, we shared a video of a 13-story residential building that was also bombed by Israeli forces. The residents of that building were given just 1 hour to evacuate. But while some of them might have been able to save their lives, they certainly weren't able to save their homes. Where are they gonna go now? And here is the Al-Sharuk Tower that was bombed just today. There it is. So we're gonna pretend as if the military capability and the defense capability of the Israeli side is equal to that of the Palestinians. That's what we're gonna pretend, right?
Yep.
Except no, we're not gonna pretend that that's the case here. We're gonna tell you the truth without fear. We're not gonna walk on eggshells. The facts are the facts. And to pretend as if both sides are equal here is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think the death toll bears that out.
Yeah, do you think, so obviously we've been watching this for days and our initial fears that the violence would get even worse and more would die and as always, it'll be 90% Palestinians who will die have been coming true. But obviously, we were talking about how we've been doing this for years and years, and obviously one of the tragic things about this is that it's so cyclical that you see these same sorts of things happening with the same lack of leadership from the United States or from the UN in large part because of the United States. Do you feel like, at least in terms of the way the media has addressed it, that it's a little bit better? I mean, CNN had an actual Palestinian reporting from Palestine that was then.
Are they not merciful?
I know, well, they wouldn't do that before,
right? No,
really.
You're right.
And the vast majority of the statements from politicians, especially in Democratic leadership, are absolute garbage. Just terrible. Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell's statements, you could just jumble them up and hand one to each and it wouldn't really make any difference. So that's the same, but you do have people like Ilhan Omar, and you have Rashida Tlaib, and you have AOC, and you have Ayanna Pressley, and you have a lot of others who are speaking out with a lot of empathy and compassion and understanding of the historical situation. I feel like it's at least a little bit better, not in terms of the leadership, but the media and some politicians. There seems to be international pressure that maybe America will be able to kneecap, but maybe that's a good sign?
I think that is a good sign. In fact, Mehdi Hassan did a great interview with Rashida Tlaib on this, and I recommend you guys check that out. He's working for Peacock, it's part of NBC. So to your point, we're finally starting to, at least in the US media, get a a different perspective that was largely ignored in previous conflicts, right? When these tensions would flare, when we would see this type of violence previously. And I'm not gonna lie, I mean, even I would have fear about talking about it honestly, openly. I felt like I had to walk on eggshells because the second you say anything that's even remotely critical of Israel's government, they're very effective in painting you as some sort of anti-Semite, when in reality, I think the worst thing you can do for the people of Israel, the Jewish people in Israel, is needlessly engage in this type of violence because you're worried about your political career. And that's exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing here. He's facing serious criminal corruption charges. He's failed to form a government. He's a complete and utter disaster. So this is what authoritarian leaders, including authoritarian leaders in the United States, do in order to remain in power, in order to garner support among constituents. They needlessly start conflicts, they scare their own people, and their people are somehow persuaded that these warmongers and these incredibly violent authoritarians are best suited to protect them during a time of conflict. That's what's happening here.
Yep.
And with that said, I want to remind you all how this started to begin with. Because again, this was largely a dormant conflict. And all of a sudden, about a month ago, something changed, and it was because of what Benjamin Netanyahu decided to do. I'm gonna go to video F3. Let's go to video F3 and watch.
This all began almost a month ago when especially young Palestinians were angered by Israeli limits on Ramadan gatherings.
Now, since the beginning of Ramadan, they have escalated to the point of absolute provocation for Palestinians everywhere.
Adding fuel to the fire is the planned eviction of several Palestinian families from homes in East Jerusalem that the Israeli courts have ruled belong to Jews.
Why did that have to happen? Why, out of nowhere, did Netanyahu decide to do this? And of course, there are the multiple raids of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. People who are practicing their religion being met with violence and brutality by Israeli forces. What was the point of that? What was the point of that? And then when you have a discussion about what's actually happening on the ground, if you have the audacity to say that Palestinians have the right to defend themselves, you're a terrible person. You don't believe in Israel's right to exist somehow, which is absolutely ridiculous. No, I believe that everyone in that region deserves a life of peace and a life of dignity. That includes Israelis and Palestinians. But that's not what we're seeing on the ground right now. And innocent Israelis are dying as a result of what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing. Yep. That's the fact. Like, that's what's really happening on the ground there. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. Anyone who acts like both sides are equal, lying to you. We're talking about the occupied versus the occupiers. We're talking about someone with military might, a side with military might, and a side that has literally nothing, okay? Yes, Hamas is retaliating with rocket strikes. That's absolutely true. But they also have the Iron Dome, which protects Israel, which is why more often than not, Hamas isn't able to hit its targets. And I think that's great. I'm glad that they have that defense capability. This is what that defense capability looks like. Just take a look at this video. This is F2. So let's stop pretending like both sides are equal. Let's be real about who the aggressors were, especially in this more recent conflict. And the United States is funding that aggression. And there are calls by progressive lawmakers to maybe question whether that US aid makes sense when it's being used to brutalize people who have been occupied.
Yeah, and when they chose to make the aid contingent on absolutely nothing. Like, usually when you are giving money, you can buy something with that, influence. That's what foreign aid is supposed to do. It's supposed to help, but it's also supposed to push countries in the direction of respect for human rights, things like that. Our government chose not to do that. Like they don't want there to be conditions, because if there are conditions and they're violated, which they certainly would be, then there have to be consequences. Like, for instance, cutting off the aid, which they don't want to do. And so they just choose, it's just free money, just hand it out. Our government, who hates giving out money.
Yep.
In this
Especially
area,
to its own people.
they want it to be totally no strings attached. And that's a Republican thing, but it's also very much a Democrat thing. And also in terms of, like you were rightly pointing out, a lot of the political calculations of politicians like Netanyahu, it would be bad enough if around the world we had these right-wing leaders who make these bold promises about their ability to protect people, with the consequence that like human rights and democracy and all that'll mostly go by the wayside if you allow these people to take power. That would be bad enough if they actually then did protect their people. But like, do you notice that they can't? That like the countries that have done the worst in regards to the pandemic are uniformly controlled by these populist right-wing leaders. That Netanyahu says he's going to keep people safe, and then he starts conflicts that result in people being killed. Sure, as you point out, Hamas is responsible. They fired the rockets, but arguably the rockets would not have been fired if the conflict hadn't been begun. So there are bad people on both sides. Some of them have far bigger guns than others. And so just start to notice the pattern. Like, they tell you the same lies and they can't save you at the end of the day.
Again, people deserve peace and a life of dignity, and Benjamin Netanyahu is offering none of that.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.